Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. Companies will take very different approaches to modernizing their supply chains with digital tools, but my guest on this episode, Dave Mazur of Kinetix, has found that successful supply chain transformation projects share some important characteristics. Kinetix is the sponsor of today's episode, and Dave notes that the decision to move ERP to the cloud is one example of a moment that can lead to really important opportunities for broader changes. Another principle of supply chain management today is that the technology landscape is constantly changing. So Dave advises that companies assess opportunities to improve areas like trading partner interaction and internal process efficiency fairly often to see how the technology marketplace has evolved. And when it comes to success with digital supply chain initiatives, Dave has a few specific suggestions based on his work with clients, including in the Dynamics 365 space. All right. Well, hi, Dave Mazur. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start with sort of some broad outlook on your perspective about supply chain and what digital supply chains mean. I know Kinetix talks very consistently about digital supply chains, moving supply activities to the cloud. Can you set out some of the parameters of what some of those concepts are all about for your team and what they mean to your customers?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of holistically talk about digitization of your supply chain. And what we mean by that is trying to figure out a way to automate 100% of the document exchange between your partners, suppliers, customers, what have you, when it comes to things like purchase orders and invoices and shipping notices of all natures. And so often we hear of places that say, "Oh, I do have an automated supply chain document exchange. I do EDI with, my big partners. I integrate into F&O. I handle the Amazons and Walmarts of the world through EDI," which is fantastic. And it's a start. And it's something that companies have been doing for 40 years. But as the supply chain gets more complex and these integrations get more demanding, we tend to almost revert back to more of a manual process when things get challenging, right? So what we try to think of is, hey, is there a way that we can really take EDI and tack on top of it? Maybe we automate a PDF order so that our customer service team isn't manually handling those types of orders. And then maybe we start integrating with portals that suppliers or vendors are logging into, kind of manage that in an automated fashion, the same way that we would treat a traditional EDI partner. It's not exactly the easiest thing. It takes kind of like a big mentality shift and really buy-in from your entire organization. It's not just IT that's dealing with these types of challenges. At the same time, it's not just like sales operations or customer support either. It really takes a group effort. And that's what we try to instill in companies that we talk to, is just this idea of, hey, this is a big collaboration. It's going to massively change the way that you think about how you do business with your trading partner community today. And it's not going to happen overnight, but there is a way to get to a point with 100% digital and 100% automated supply chain document exchange within your partner community.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to a couple of the things you just touched on, especially around, how an organization gets behind this from a leadership perspective and maybe sort of from across the organization, as you were talking about. But I wanted to maybe dive a little deeper into maybe what's part of the root of some of these challenges, which is how fragmented I imagine most organizations to be at this point in time. I would assume most companies are not all paper-based anymore or not doing things in a very manual way, even if it's electronic. But, when you look across supply chain technology, I imagine some cloud, some on-premises stuff, some really manual, maybe paper-based still. What kind of conversations do you have with your customers or with prospects that are struggling with that kind of a mix? And is that the norm to see some kind of a mix today?
It's funny. You'd be surprised how much paper still exists, or I guess you should really just say like manual process still exists, whether it's someone going into, some portal and pulling down an invoice or something along those lines. But no, these are conversations that we're having every day with different prospects and customers of ours. And a lot of the times these conversations happen when they're moving from some legacy platform and saying, hey, we're bringing ERP into the cloud and specifically working with F&O within D365. Very oftentimes there was some sort of a translator or integration tool that was on premise. Maybe it was managed in-house, something along those lines to handle the big partners. But there's almost always some sort of, I'm just going to keep saying paper, even though I'll use that in loosely in kind of air quotes, but manual processing that's just not capable of going through an integration model. And those are the types of conversations that happen when someone says, hey, I'm taking the leap. We have this cloud initiative. We're going through a massive business change to move ERP into the cloud. How do we really capitalize on all the technology today? Because what we're doing now is something that we've been doing for 20 years, 15 years, even 10 years. Like the technology shift has been so great in the past 5 or 10 years that chances are if you haven't readjusted to today, you're doing something outdated, right? It's kind of corny, but it's almost like saying what do they say, like car insurance? Like if you haven't shopped it in the past couple of years, you're probably paying too much money for car insurance. Really, the same thing goes with technology, right? If you're not keeping up to date, you're using something that's really antiquated.
Yeah, interesting. And I think I know what you mean. Are there any examples of things that maybe it's common these days for organizations to have maybe fallen behind on without having noticed that you offer?
Yeah. So a lot of times companies are still relying on customer support teams to handle their long tail partners, right? So yes, they've integrated their big partners, but at the same time, they're still having, a team of CS folks firm up orders instead of running cross references to check, part numbers and quantities and inventory or up to date pricing. We're actually in a scenario right now where a company has both off invoice discounting as well as like kind of discounting by time of year. And they use tools that are integrated into F&O for their CS team to kind of look those things up. But what we're working on them with is a way to automate those kind of cross-reference lookups to make sure that the pricing models that their customers are sending to them on their POs match these discounts. And it makes it so that their CS team doesn't need to do any kind of look up against that. It can just be an automated process where PO comes in, VLOOKUP occurs, and if the pricing model is incorrect, we send a notification back to the customer, and if it is, then it just firms up the order and flows in an automated fashion. That's just one kind of tiny example, but these types of things are so time consuming that even something as simple as that can be a massive time saver for a team of CS folks when you're talking about, 60, 70,000 purchase orders a month, right?
Yeah. And if you're impacting some significant percentage of those, it's a really big deal.
Yeah. And impacting these customers, right? If you're holding up the purchase order, ultimately you're holding up the shipment. And then, if it's a kind of like a B2B2C model, ultimately holding up the end customer as well.
I wanted to go back to a point you had made earlier, which was, I guess, maybe the sort of the organizational impact and or challenge of some of these goals and the initiatives that companies do invest in. And I thought first about sort of the leadership angle of it. So like, who is typically leading a supply chain transformation initiative if it's going to be successful?
So there's almost 2 points to that. The first is more of what types of companies are leading these initiatives. And usually what we see is it's the buyers that are able to kind of, really kick something like this off. And sometimes it's even buying groups that have this kind of power, because you probably know, but in the world of supply chain document exchange, the person sending the purchase order really has the power. So they can really dictate to their community, hey, this is the way that we want to do business. So usually it's the buying groups that that kick these things off. But at the same time, if you're a manufacturer or a supplier of some sort of good, it doesn't mean that you have to sit and wait for your customers to come to you. Then the second part of that is, like kind of like who within the organization this impacts. And it's a huge combination, right? It usually, when we talk about ERP projects in general, it's something that starts with, CIOs and really just IT in general. Typically that's who has these cloud first initiatives. And it's also the people or the teams, I should say, that in the past had to manage these in-house integration tools. That always would fall on IT. And it was challenging because typically an IT person doesn't really understand how they work or how your company works with each of their customers or each one of their vendors. So it's this kind of like strange cross function where IT people are managing it, but it's really like a customer support or a business analyst that has the knowledge to then share back with the IT person. So when we talk about these initiatives as a whole, that's when we start to get into sales operations, customer success, and IT all together, and really looking at this holistically and saying, okay, this is going to impact me on these three teams. And then it gets even more complicated truly when you start throwing in purchasing from your supplier base, because then you start talking about procurement and finance getting impacted by this too. So these aren't small conversations. They're big conversations. They're very cross functional. And that's why we see these conversations happening so often when companies are going through, large ERP migrations or implementations and, moving something that's may have been in place for 20 years into the cloud.
That's an interesting point because, and it's funny how often that comes up, that I did a recent podcast just talking about, it was about security and permission settings and setup for users of Business Central in this case. But, the point came up pretty quickly that, once you start evaluating how something like permissions in that case, affects all these different types of users, different departments, different types of roles and responsibilities, all of a sudden you're talking broad process, cross-organizational process, and you first start discovering things you didn't know, and it starts creating these conversations of, how these different roles all need to kind of get on board with changes that are coming, whether it's in this case, maybe focused on supply chain capabilities, but the ERP seems to somehow still be at the center of that.
It does. And one of the things that we like to try to get to and kind of get across is that once implementations happen, we'd like to take as much of this process off of IT's plate as possible, right? Because it doesn't, like, supply chain doesn't equal IT in our opinion, at least. So oftentimes, back with older solutions that were kind of managed in-house and managed by IT, it was like, okay, my customer had this, a shipping notice that failed a validation for, a missing part number or customer part number, something like that. Those errors or failed validations would typically go back to IT because they were the only people that had access to go back and manually key in the customer part number and reprocess the document. But in reality, the customer manager that deals with that customer probably has that information much more readily available than someone in IT. Also probably cares a whole lot more about their standing with that customer than someone in IT. So we try to kind of push this back and say, hey, IT, we need you when we implement. We need your input on kind of how these systems are working together. But once all is said and done, let's take this off of your plate and put this onto someone that knows it inside and out and truthfully cares about it a lot.
That sort of leads me to, the next thing I was thinking of, which is when it comes to the expertise that's really required for this kind of investment to be successful within an organization, maybe even through like a partner as well. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what kind of skills or what kind of team members can really influence the success of deploying some of these kinds of improved capabilities?
Yeah. So when we, or really any other, provider that's kind of thinking about this today, when we talk to a prospect and say, hey, like this is kind of the need on your end in terms of expertise, we really talk about, someone needs to be an F&O expert. Usually that's not someone at our prospect. Usually it's the company handling their integration or their implementation, I should say, which is great. The big SIs of the world are extremely helpful in kind of knowing where data is coming from and where it needs to go to be accessed in F&O. So that's one part of it. But then I'd say the biggest piece is we need someone that knows the business and knows how your business specifically works with customer X and supplier Y, because you could be the best supply chain automation company in the world, but you don't know your prospect to the degree of, hey, this is how they work with Home Depot as opposed to how one of their competitors does, things of that nature. So you need someone that knows ERP, that knows the business. And then because there's so much buy-in cross-functionally, like we mentioned earlier, you also need someone that's, can help manage this project and keep everyone honest in terms of staying on ball, right?
And what about, I guess you call it trading partners, people outside the organization that will be impacted by this kind of change in the way an organization works? As you said, so many departments involved with outside trading partners.
Yeah, so the partner, like I keep kind of saying back when we did EDI back in those days, and it's still there. When it was EDI, the partner always played a role in testing, right? Like you had to fall into their testing schedule and make sure that we were kind of adhering to their standards and getting on their books for when they were available to test. So that's always been a factor. But when we really talk about 100% digitalization, you may be changing the way that a customer buys from you or a supplier invoices you. We try to have as little impact as possible on the customer, because you don't really want to say, hey, if you're going to buy from me, you need to do it in this manner. But maybe they send their purchase orders as an attachment instead of the body of an email, or send it to a different email address, or upload it to a directory on there local to them instead of emailing it in general. So there's always buy-in, I guess I would say, from your partner community as well. And when we went back to the types of companies that initiate these things, it's much, much easier when you're the buyer to say, hey, if you want us to purchase from you, this is how we're going to do it. And that's why those companies have kind of like I don't want to say upper hand, but they have the power to make these types of initiatives a whole lot easier than a manufacturer or a supplier.
Any other recommendations that you make to your customers when you maybe have conversations with Dynamics users about successful initiatives around digital supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to planning, right? I mean, you don't do anything without a whole lot of planning. And I'd say the first step in that planning is getting together the right people to say, hey, these are the folks that we need from IT, from sales, from customer management, from finance, that know the business the best and know the legacy platform, know our go forward strategies the best, and can set this up for success. Then you really need to figure out what a successful implementation of this means to your company. So maybe it is 100% digitalization. Maybe it's 85%. Whatever success is to you, you kind of need to be able to define that so that then you can say, is the solution that I'm looking at able to meet those KPIs, or is the solution that I'm looking for really only going to handle my two big partners or something like that. So those are kind of like the first steps, right? It's just making sure you have the right people, making a plan, figuring out if you what your KPIs should be, and make sure that you're looking at solutions that support those. Then you really need to work hand in hand with your SI to make sure that all of like the master data is able to speak with these solutions and integrate with these solutions. It kind of goes back to that idea of the discounting, or I just almost like real-time discounting pricing scenario that I mentioned earlier. If you're not looking at those types of things, and you're probably never going to get to the 100% mark, then obviously, like we talked about a couple minutes ago, you have to get your trading partners on board. So this is something that needs to be communicated to them, and ultimately your solution provider can help with scenarios like that, but you still own relationships with your trading partners, and you know them better than anyone else. So those kind of like the buy-in from your partners typically comes from your company internally. And then I guess it's keep that project manager to keep the entire project team on track and really have a great relationship with the solution provider that you choose, because again, like this isn't an overnight kind of conversation. It's also not an overnight implementation. It's usually not even a one phase type of implementation. It's something that starts when you start talking about ERP projects. It's usually not something that waits until ERP is live, and then it typically reaches fruition maybe a year after or 2 years after implementation or ERP has gone live, and your big partners are automated, starting to chip away at all the others. If that makes sense, it's not overnight.
Absolutely. I can certainly understand that. I do imagine that these days with cloud ERP being so prevalent, and the nature of sort of the ongoing updates to that kind of a system as opposed to on-premise sort of monolithic system, that it's maybe a little easier for companies to accept the idea of kind of continuing to push forward, to continue to iterate with adding capabilities like what you're talking about over time, and maybe not, I don't know, maybe this is too hopeful of me, but not losing momentum, I guess, and continuing to push ahead.
It is. So I've been at TIE for 7 years. And when I joined, the kind of the ongoing joke was that 5 years ago, they had been talking about XML killing off EDI, and that XML integration was going to be the only type of integration. And then we started talking about API integrations as, going to kill off everything else. And in reality, it's just a combination of all of these things. It's taking the resources that we have available to ourselves and making the most of them. And CIOs and VPs of technology are, for now at least, they're keeping up with the times and doing their best to stay on top of the technologies out there. And there's such a big focus on that because there's so much technology out there that it is a little bit easier to say, hey, look, this is the type of technology that exists and we should be taking advantage of it. Because again, if you're not, then you're kind of running your business. Even if you're on the latest and greatest cloud ERP, you're running your business like you did 20 years ago, instead of, capitalizing on all the technology that exists that surrounds these cloud ERPs, and specifically D365 and F&O.
Great. Well, really interesting to hear your perspective on some of these things, certainly as they fit into these other trends that I'm seeing, and certainly our readers are seeing as well. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about it, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. It was fun.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks once again to Dave Mazur for joining. And this message from our sponsor, Kinetix. For more information on how Kinetix helps Microsoft Dynamics customers digitize their supply chains, please visit www.tiekinetix.com. That's TIEKINETIX. Or check out their Starter's Guide to Digital Supply Chain Transformation white paper, which is on MSDW. We will link to that in the show notes. And that's it for this episode. If you want to reach me, you can send me an email, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com, and follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter for all of our updates. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.